May 1940. In a dimly lit office inside Berlin's Reich Air Ministry, Hermann Göring leaned back in his chair, the gold braid of his uniform shimmering under the lamp. On his desk lay an American intelligence report so audacious he could hardly contain himself. Franklin Roosevelt had just asked Congress for the authority to build 50,000 warplanes every year, more than 12 times what the United States had ever produced. Göring chuckled, then erupted in laughter, his voice echoing against the marble walls. To him, this was not a threat, but a farce. America was a land of farmers and factory workers, untested in modern war. Its Army Air Corps was small, its pilots inexperienced, its factories designed for cars and refrigerators, not the precision engineering of aircraft. In Göring's mind, the Reich's Luftwaffe, already blooding Europe with relentless air campaigns, stood as an unshakable master of the skies. He dismissed the report with a contemptuous wave of his hand. The Americans, he sneered, might as well try to build castles out of paper. What Göring could not see, and what his prejudice blinded him to, was that even as he laughed, across the Atlantic, an industrial revolution was already stirring. Detroit's factories were humming with a new purpose. Roosevelt had summoned the architects of American industry, men who had risen from immigrant backgrounds and automotive assembly lines, and charged them with a task history would call impossible. At the center of this mobilization stood William Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who had risen to the presidency of General Motors. For the symbolic sum of $1 a year, he had left his fortune behind to orchestrate the greatest industrial transformation the world had ever witnessed. While Göring scoffed at Roosevelt's vision, Knudsen was already sketching the blueprints of an arsenal that would dwarf the Luftwaffe into irrelevance. On paper, Germany seemed destined to dominate the air war. Its fighters were battle-tested, its bombers feared, its production already geared for conquest. America, by comparison, seemed weak, producing just 3,611 military aircraft in all of 1939. Yet beneath the surface of this imbalance, a storm was gathering. Göring had read the numbers but failed to understand their meaning. He believed racial superiority and authoritarian control guaranteed victory. What he ignored was the quiet, relentless power of a free people when roused from peace to war. In his laughter on that spring night lay the sound of Germany's future defeat, a miscalculation so vast it would bury the Reich beneath mountains of American steel and aluminum. By the summer of 1940, as Europe burned, America was still a nation in denial. The average citizen read about the fall of France or the bombing of London as though it were happening on another planet. Roosevelt, however, saw what others did not. He understood that time was the one resource America did not have. If the Nazis consolidated Europe, if Britain fell, the Atlantic itself would become a German lake. And when that day came, the United States would face an industrial juggernaut it was wholly unprepared to confront. Roosevelt knew that the only shield against such a fate would not be speeches, nor diplomacy, but machines, planes, tanks, ships, built on a scale no democracy had ever attempted. And so he issued the challenge. Not just 50,000 planes a year, but a complete reimagining of what American factories could be. The military balked. Generals scoffed at the idea that civilian auto companies could produce warplanes. A bomber, they argued, was not a Buick. A fighter was not a Chevrolet. The tolerances were too fine, the engineering too advanced. Yet Roosevelt ignored their skepticism. Instead, he turned to men who had never worn uniforms, but had built the backbone of the American economy. Henry Ford, Charles Sorensen, William Knudsen, and scores of industrialists who knew how to turn blueprints into reality at lightning speed. Roosevelt wagered that American ingenuity, when unleashed, could outperform any authoritarian system. It was a gamble on democracy itself. At first, progress was slow. In 1940, the entire nation's aviation industry produced fewer than 5,000 aircraft, barely enough to equip Britain with a trickle of aid. Yet beneath the surface, something seismic was shifting. Knudsen began tearing apart the old structures of military procurement, demanding faster approvals, standardized parts, and mass production techniques stolen directly from Detroit's assembly lines. The auto giants began training thousands of new workers, many of them women who had never held a rivet gun in their lives. Factories were stripped, refitted, and reborn overnight. It was not perfection they aimed for at first, but scale. Knudsen believed that if America could learn to build cars by the millions, it could just as easily learn to build planes by the tens of thousands. And still, across the Atlantic, Göring sneered. Reports of America's mobilization trickled into Berlin, but he dismissed them as propaganda, insisting that a land of consumers could never become a land of warriors. He would learn too late that he was wrong. The day was coming when the skies over Germany would be blackened, not by dreams of empire, but by the thunder of American bombers rolling off Detroit's assembly lines like clockwork. In the autumn of 1940, while Britain braced for nightly Luftwaffe raids, Roosevelt summoned America's industrial titans to Washington. The atmosphere was tense, as though a new kind of war council had been convened, not of generals and admirals, but of businessmen and engineers. At the center of it all was William Knudsen, the quiet Dane with a reputation for solving the impossible. Roosevelt looked him in the eye and gave him a charge as clear as it was staggering. "Bill, we need airplanes, and we need them fast. You are going to build the arsenal of democracy." Knudsen accepted without hesitation, though he knew the task defied reason. It meant retooling every assumption, every habit, every machine in American manufacturing. Knudsen's genius lay not in designing planes himself, but in orchestrating men and methods. He believed that every factory, from the smallest machine shop in Ohio to the largest assembly line in Detroit, had a role to play. Under his vision, civilian companies would be drafted into the war effort as though they were regiments of an army. Kitchen appliance makers would turn out precision ball bearings. Typewriter companies would produce machine gun parts. Car factories would build wings and fuselages instead of fenders and doors. It was a mosaic of industry, every piece vital to the whole, every gear in motion toward one single purpose: victory. Resistance came swiftly. Military officers grumbled that these outsiders were meddling in matters they did not understand. Engineers complained that aircraft tolerances were far too delicate for assembly line production. Even labor unions feared that wartime contracts would strip workers of their rights. Knudsen, however, pressed forward. He worked with Henry Ford to design a factory so vast and unprecedented it would make history: Willow Run. There, on farmland outside Detroit, Ford's engineers planned an assembly line a mile long, capable of producing a 4-engine bomber every single hour. It was a dream bordering on madness, and yet the blueprints were already on the drafting tables. Meanwhile, German intelligence monitored these developments with skepticism. Reports of Willow Run sounded absurd to the Reich's planners. A bomber every hour? Impossible. To their minds, America's democratic chaos would collapse under its own inefficiency. They had no understanding of the discipline of the assembly line, the relentless rhythm of American mass production. Göring, still laughing at Roosevelt's 50,000 planes, dismissed Willow Run as fantasy. But in those cavernous hangars, still under construction, a revolution was taking shape, one that would turn America's fields of corn into fields of bombers and forever change the balance of the war. Winter 1941 brought with it both urgency and fear. Britain was battered but unbroken, clinging to survival through American aid shipments across the Atlantic. Yet in Washington, Roosevelt's gamble was still far from paying off. Willow Run was only skeletal steel beams rising out of frozen farmland. Workers were scarce, engineers overwhelmed, and skeptics louder than ever. Even within the White House, advisers warned Roosevelt that his promises of 50,000 planes had become a dangerous political liability. But the president refused to retreat. He understood that America's strength was not yet visible. It was still incubating, still waiting to explode into being. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. December the 7th, 1941, shattered illusions of distance and safety. Overnight, the question was no longer whether America would mobilize, but how fast. Within hours, Knudsen's industrial blueprints became matters of life and death. Factories that had been debating costs and contracts suddenly had no choice. War had come to their doorstep. The hum of machinery grew louder, the training of new workers accelerated, and Willow Run, though unfinished, became a beacon of urgency. No longer was this an experiment in mass production. It was now a race against annihilation. Willow Run soon faced its first great test. Building a bomber was not like building a car. A B-24 Liberator contained over 1 million individual parts, and assembling it required precision down to the smallest rivet. Early attempts were disastrous. Completed aircraft rolled off the line, but failed quality checks, their wings misaligned, their engines unreliable. Critics pointed to the failures as proof that Göring had been right all along. Democracy could not produce war machines with the ruthless efficiency of dictatorship. For a time, it seemed as though the skeptics might be vindicated. But Knudsen and Ford's engineers refused to accept defeat. They broke down every stage of production into smaller, manageable tasks. Women who had never before set foot in a factory were trained to drill, rivet, and weld with mechanical precision. African American workers, long excluded from industrial jobs, were hired in unprecedented numbers, their labor vital to the war effort despite ongoing discrimination. Slowly, painfully, the system began to stabilize. Mistakes diminished, output rose, and the assembly line found its rhythm. What had begun as chaos was becoming order. In Berlin, Göring still laughed when told of Willow Run's growing activity. To him, the idea of American housewives and immigrant laborers building warplanes was ridiculous. Yet he could not see what was truly happening. The awakening of a sleeping giant, its factories roaring to life with a power the Reich could neither match nor imagine. By mid-1942, the transformation was unmistakable. The smoke rising from Detroit's factories no longer signaled cars rolling off assembly lines, but machines of war destined for the skies over Europe and the Pacific. Willow Run, once dismissed as an impossible dream, now stretched across the Michigan landscape like a monument to American willpower. Its assembly line was the longest in the world, so vast that workers rode bicycles from one end to the other. The first months had been plagued with failures, but now the rhythm of production began to thunder. A bomber every day, then every few hours, and soon, exactly as Knudsen had promised, one B-24 Liberator every single hour. It was a sight so staggering that even seasoned generals could hardly believe it. Visitors walking through Willow Run described an endless procession of half-built bombers sliding forward on conveyor belts, their aluminum skins gleaming under factory lights. At one station, women riveters hunched over metal panels, their drills biting into steel with unerring speed. At another, men who had once made refrigerators or typewriters now fitted machine guns into bomber turrets. And when the final product rolled off the line, a massive 4-engine B-24, workers often cheered as though they themselves were sending a weapon into battle. This was not happening at Willow Run alone. Across the nation, thousands of factories echoed with the same relentless pace. General Motors was producing aircraft engines by the tens of thousands. Chrysler had turned its plants into a city of tank assembly lines. Boeing's factories in Seattle grew so large that they required entire camouflage roofs painted to look like suburban neighborhoods from the sky, just to confuse potential enemy bombers. America's industrial base had become a living organism, growing, multiplying, consuming resources, and spitting out weapons at a scale no empire in history had ever matched. For Göring and the Luftwaffe High Command, the reports arriving from across the Atlantic were troubling, yet still dismissed. They could not comprehend the sheer mathematics of America's output. Germany's factories, constrained by limited resources and constant Allied bombing, struggled to produce a few thousand aircraft each year. America, by contrast, was on track to deliver not 10,000, not 20,000, but 50,000 planes annually, exactly the number Roosevelt had once proclaimed. Göring had laughed at the goal. Now his laughter was fading, replaced by something he had not felt before. Doubt. The summer of 1943 marked the moment when Roosevelt's impossible promise became a living nightmare for Germany. For the first time, German civilians looked up and saw swarms of American bombers stretching from horizon to horizon. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, built in the thousands by American hands, now filled the skies in numbers so vast that they blotted out the sun. Each carried tons of bombs, each escorted by fighters that Germany could scarcely replace. What had begun as blueprints in Washington and assembly lines in Detroit was now raining destruction on the heart of the Reich. The raids were relentless. Hamburg, Cologne, and the industrial Ruhr Valley became nightly infernos. German factories that had once churned out Messerschmitts and Junkers were reduced to twisted skeletons of steel. Railways were torn apart, oil refineries destroyed, and entire cities burned for days. Luftwaffe pilots, once confident masters of the sky, now found themselves overwhelmed by waves of bombers escorted by the sleek P-51 Mustang, a fighter that could escort American planes all the way to Berlin and back. Losses mounted so quickly that even Göring, once boastful and arrogant, began to despair. He famously admitted, "When I saw American planes flying over Berlin in daylight, I knew the war was lost." On the ground, ordinary Germans were stunned. Many had believed Göring's promise that no enemy aircraft would ever penetrate the Reich's skies. Now, the thunder of engines overhead became a daily reality, and with it came the realization that Germany could not outbuild its enemy. The Luftwaffe scrambled to defend the homeland, but every fighter shot down represented a loss Germany could not replace. America, by contrast, was producing new aircraft faster than they could be destroyed. The numbers told the story. By 1943, America was building more planes in a single year than Germany had built in the entire war. Every month, Willow Run alone produced more bombers than all of Germany's factories combined. Göring had gambled that America's democracy would never find the discipline to wage industrial war. He had been catastrophically wrong. The Reich had awakened the sleeping giant Roosevelt once warned of, and now its skies were filled with the consequences. The industrial miracle was no longer hidden in factories. It was visible in the burning cities of Germany, in the wreckage of shattered Luftwaffe squadrons, and in the growing realization that no wall of propaganda could shield civilians from the truth roaring above their heads. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was fighting a war it could no longer sustain. It wasn't just the overwhelming numbers of American aircraft, it was the invisible chokehold of resources that strangled Germany from within. Every B-24 and B-17 roaring out of America's factories carried with it more than bombs. It carried the crushing arithmetic of industrial war. For every bomber lost, America could build 2, sometimes 3 more within weeks. For every German fighter destroyed, the Reich struggled to replace it at all. Fuel was the most desperate shortage. The Allied bombing campaigns did not merely target cities, they went straight for the veins of Germany's war machine, synthetic oil plants, refineries and transport lines. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe's vaunted fighters became nothing more than idle skeletons on airstrips. By 1944, many squadrons could barely conduct training flights. Veteran pilots, once feared across Europe, sat grounded while American pilots gained experience in wave after wave of combat missions. The Reich had planes, but no fuel to fly them. The skies were lost not just to bombs, but to mathematics. Meanwhile, the industrial miracle of the United States showed no signs of slowing. Detroit was not merely producing airplanes, it was producing engines, spare parts, ammunition, and replacements in a continuous torrent. Factories ran 24 hours a day, with shifts of men and women working through the night under blinding lamps, driven by the unshakable urgency of total war. In a single year, America produced more aluminum than Germany had in the entire conflict. Every rivet, every propeller blade, every gallon of high-octane aviation fuel represented a weapon Germany could not counter. On the German home front, despair spread quietly. Civilians whispered of the endless bombings, the shortages, the burned-out shells of once proud cities. Soldiers, turning from the front, saw with their own eyes what Göring's arrogance had concealed. Germany was being outbuilt, outproduced, and outlasted. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was no longer a shield but a crumbling facade. For Göring, the humiliation was personal. He had mocked Roosevelt's 50,000 plane promise, laughing at the thought of farmers and factory girls building machines of war. But now those same workers, men and women he would have dismissed as inferior, were flooding the skies of Europe with American steel. The Reich was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, and each bomber overhead was proof that Göring's laughter had turned into the hollow silence of defeat. Cornered and desperate, the Reich turned to what it called Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons. If Germany could not match America in numbers, it would try to leap ahead in technology. Engineers unveiled the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, a machine so advanced it seemed plucked from the future. With blistering speed and firepower, it could tear through bomber formations before escorts had time to react. To Göring and Hitler, the jet was a salvation, a way to reverse the tide of the air war. But salvation never came. For every jet the Luftwaffe managed to assemble, America produced hundreds of conventional fighters. The Me 262 was plagued with problems, shortages of materials, unreliable engines, and Hitler's own meddling, demanding it be outfitted as a bomber rather than left to dominate the skies as a pure interceptor. Worse still, even when jets flew, they needed fuel that Germany no longer possessed. Pilots often had only minutes of flight time for training, entering combat with aircraft they barely knew how to handle. Technology without resources was a hollow hope, and the Reich bled men and machines faster than it could replace them. The contrast was brutal. In the United States, factories rolled out P-51 Mustangs by the thousands, pairing range with agility in a way that doomed the Luftwaffe. American bombers flew deeper and longer, escorted every mile by fighters that seemed endless in number. Radar networks, communications, and logistics, all powered by America's industrial abundance, wove the bombers into unstoppable streams across German skies. For every miracle weapon Germany built, America buried it under an avalanche of steel. By 1944, the truth was undeniable. German civilians no longer looked up in awe at jets streaking overhead. They looked up in terror at the endless armadas of bombers and fighters blotting out the horizon. The Luftwaffe had gone from attacker to defender, from predator to prey. And Göring, once so certain that the United States could never retool its factories for war, now sat powerless as his Luftwaffe disintegrated before his eyes. The miracle weapons were too few, too late, and too flawed. They were born of desperation, not strength. Against the colossal weight of America's arsenal, no innovation could alter the outcome. Germany had tried to gamble on the future, but it was drowning in the present, suffocated by the sheer scale of the war machine that democracy had unleashed. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in history, and behind it all was the quiet thunder of American factories. Before a single soldier set foot on the beaches of Normandy, the skies above France were already ruled by the arsenal of democracy. Weeks of preparation had seen thousands of American bombers and fighters roar across the English Channel, pounding railroads, bridges, supply depots, and coastal defences. German reinforcements found themselves cut off, their movements strangled by a relentless curtain of bombs. For the Wehrmacht, the invasion was a nightmare long before the first landing craft touched sand. Troops waiting near the coast reported endless waves of American planes overhead, so many that the very sound became a psychological weapon. Convoys dared not move in daylight. Tanks risked destruction the moment they left cover. German generals pleaded for air support, but the Luftwaffe could provide little more than token resistance. Their fighters were few, their pilots inexperienced, their fuel nearly gone. On D-Day itself, the Luftwaffe managed only scattered sorties, easily swatted from the sky by swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts. The result was absolute dominance. Paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines found German columns paralyzed, unable to advance without being annihilated from above. Allied troops storming Omaha and Utah beaches knew that, despite the horrific losses, the skies belonged to them. It was a luxury German soldiers no longer had, the certainty that enemy bombers could appear at any hour, in any place, with devastating effect. Behind that dominance lay numbers so vast they defied belief. In the first half of 1944 alone, America produced nearly 50,000 aircraft, more than the entire Luftwaffe fielded in combat. The invasion was not just a feat of bravery and strategy, it was the visible proof of what Roosevelt, Knudsen, and Detroit's workers had built. Germany's fortified walls, its coastal guns, its armies, none of it mattered when the skies were lost. For Göring, D-Day was the final humiliation. He had once promised Hitler that no enemy soldier would ever set foot on German-controlled soil while the Luftwaffe lived. Yet as the beaches of Normandy filled with Allied troops, his once proud air force was little more than a memory. The Reich's fate was sealed not just by the soldiers who stormed ashore, but by the bombers and fighters that had made their passage possible. The skies, once Germany's greatest weapon, had become the anvil upon which the Reich was shattered. By late 1944, Germany was a nation living under the constant shadow of American bombers. The raids no longer came only at night, as they had in Britain. They came in broad daylight, in endless streams of silver aircraft glinting in the sun. Civilians in Berlin, Munich, and Dresden would watch the contrails stretch across the horizon, knowing that beneath those vapor trails lay thousands of tons of explosives. The sound of engines became the soundtrack of daily life, a low, endless thunder that reminded everyone that the skies were no longer theirs. Factories vanished beneath waves of destruction. Entire industrial districts, once proud symbols of German power, were reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. Bridges collapsed into rivers, rail networks twisted into unusable wreckage, and fuel depots exploded into fireballs that could be seen for miles. The Allies called it strategic bombing. For German civilians, it was a slow-motion apocalypse. Each raid left cities darker, colder, hungrier. Children grew up in cellars, families carried their lives in bundles from one bomb shelter to another, and the belief in victory crumbled with every collapsing wall. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, had become a ghost of its former self. Young boys barely out of flight school were sent up against swarms of American Mustangs, often dying within days of their first mission. Veteran pilots who once boasted of hundreds of victories now fought in futility, outnumbered 10-1, their aircraft inferior, their fuel rationed. Göring, bloated and bitter, raged at his commanders, demanding miracles that no longer existed. His promise that no enemy bomb would fall on German cities had turned into the bitterest of jokes. And still the factories of America roared. In 1944 alone, the United States produced nearly 100,000 aircraft, more than Germany had built in the entire war. Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles became the engines of destruction, spitting out planes faster than the Reich could shoot them down. What Göring had once dismissed as a fantasy was now grinding Germany into dust. By early 1945, the consequences were undeniable. Germany's armies were retreating on every front, its cities reduced to smoking ruins, its skies ruled by foreign planes. The war that Hitler and Göring had unleashed was coming home in fire and steel, carried on the wings of the very machines they once said America could never build. The Reich was collapsing, not just from defeat on the battlefield, but from the industrial avalanche it had mocked and underestimated. In the spring of 1945, as the Allies closed in from every direction, Hermann Göring retreated into a haze of denial. The man who had once strutted across Europe as Hitler's chosen successor now sat in his Bavarian estate, bloated in body and broken in spirit. Once the commander of the world's most feared air force, he now presided over little more than ruins. His Luftwaffe was gone, its planes destroyed, its pilots dead, its airfields cratered. The skies that had once been his realm now belonged to America and its allies. Göring could not escape the irony. He had laughed when Roosevelt promised 50,000 planes, had sneered at the idea of American factories turning out war machines by the hour. Yet it was that laughter, that arrogance, that blinded him to the truth. The United States had not only built Roosevelt's planes, it had built an industrial army so vast that Germany never had a chance. Göring's pride had become his prison. When he heard the drone of bombers overhead, he knew that every explosion, every building reduced to rubble, was proof of his greatest miscalculation. The reports that reached him were unbearable. Cities reduced to ash, civilians fleeing in endless columns, soldiers surrendering in the tens of thousands. The Reich he had once believed unshakable was collapsing faster than he could comprehend. Even Hitler, raging in his Berlin bunker, blamed Göring for the disaster, accusing him of betrayal, incompetence, cowardice. The man who had promised to keep German skies inviolate was now branded as the one who had failed most completely. By April, Göring's fall was absolute. As American tanks rolled into Germany, his once proud estates were surrounded. He was captured not as a commander, but as a fugitive, surrendering to men he had once considered inferior. In his possession were silken uniforms, opulent treasures, and vials of morphine, symbols, not of strength, but of decay. The Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe was finished. And yet history remembers not his riches or his titles, but his laughter. The laughter that had mocked Roosevelt's challenge. That sound echoed through the ruins of Germany, a bitter reminder that arrogance had blinded an empire to the truth. America had built the impossible, Göring had dismissed it. And in that fatal miscalculation, the fate of the Reich was sealed. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world surveyed the wreckage of a war unlike any before. Germany lay in ruins, its cities reduced to smoking craters, its armies shattered, its leaders dead or in chains. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years of dominance had not survived even 12. And at the heart of its downfall was not only the courage of soldiers on distant battlefields, but the steel, sweat, and spirit of a nation across the ocean. Franklin D. Roosevelt had once spoken words that seemed impossible. 50,000 planes, an arsenal of democracy, a people united by production. Men like William Knudsen, who traded the comfort of Detroit boardrooms for the challenge of mobilization, had taken those words and turned them into reality. Women who had never set foot in a factory became Rosie the Riveters, bending steel, welding wings, and proving that America's strength was not just in its machines, but in its people. Immigrants, farmers, mechanics, all found themselves part of a collective effort that dwarfed anything the world had seen. Hermann Göring had laughed. He had sneered that America was a land of playboys and amateurs, incapable of war, incapable of sacrifice. But it was that laughter, blind, arrogant, dismissive, that became the echo of Germany's defeat. The Luftwaffe could not outfly it. Hitler's armies could not outfight it. No miracle weapon could silence it. Against the unstoppable tide of American production, the Reich crumbled piece by piece, city by city, until nothing remained but ashes. And in those ashes lay a lesson. Wars are not won only on battlefields, but in the factories, the shipyards, the assembly lines, where ordinary people transform into the beating heart of a nation's power. America had shown the world that democracy, when pushed to its limits, could outbuild tyranny, could outlast brutality, could overwhelm empires. As the war ended, Roosevelt himself was gone, taken by illness before victory could be celebrated. But his vision lived on in every plane that soared, every tank that rolled, every soldier who returned home. Göring's laughter had faded into silence, drowned out by the thunder of factories that never stopped, and by a truth that would echo for generations. The arsenal of democracy had saved the world.